Yo, what's going on? So a couple weeks ago, I did a video on my first impressions of Koala Sampler. It's an app that can be downloaded on iOS or Android. I have it on my iPad, but this app is really capable, especially if you're a new producer or if you're a producer who is on the road and you just want to sort of play around with samples. This can do a lot of things. But I got a few comments on my last video from people saying I should get the expansion on the app. It's like $4 around there, and it gives you a few more capabilities. It's called Samurai, and that's exactly what I did. I spent the $4 and got the additional capabilities of this app. I think the base app was somewhere around $6, $6 or $7, and the expansion was around $4, so we're looking at $10 to $12. If you already have an iPad or any tablet or even your phone, it's a super cheap sampler, especially considering what it can do. So I just want to go through some of those capabilities that did get added from that Samurai expansion, because I think some of them are super valuable for me. So I already have a sample recorded into the app that we can chop up. The sample's from this record right here, the Dells versus the Dramatics. It's this cool kind of collaborative album from two classic soul groups. I love them both. And I got this record on a recent digging trip I did. So I just want to give a huge shout out to Hello Records and People's Records, both in Detroit. They're amazing record shops, like just boxes and boxes of 45s, amazing soul records, and the prices were great. I don't think record stores like that always get the recognition that they should for contributing to music culture. I mean, they basically have musical artifacts sitting on their shelves to buy. But just a huge shout out to those two spots, Hello Records and People's Records, both in Detroit. I took a recent digging trip there and I was there for like 24 hours, and I was in each store for like 3 hours plus. But let's get into this beat. We'll start off just by chopping up the sample, and that brings me to what I think is the biggest improvement that you get from expanding your app to the Samurai edition of Koala, and that is the auto chop feature. By adding this feature, you have a few different ways that you can chop the samples rather than having to copy the sample onto multiple pads and then trimming it manually on each of those individual pads. You can now chop the samples by sort of tapping in the chops, which is what I'm going to do. You can do thresholds, which would be great for drums or something like that. Or you can do regions. So if your initial sample is, let's say, a perfect 2 bars, you could then chop that into 8 regions and you'll have 8 perfectly timed chops. So I have the sample selected right here. I'm just going to go to Tools and then Auto Chop, and then Lazy is what they call the one where you can manually sort of pin the samples as the sample's playing. But the first thing you're going to want to do is set the volume and pitch of your sample, because once you chop it, it's going to use that initial volume and pitch for all of the ones following. And if you wanted to edit it after the fact, you would have to do each of those samples individually. So I'm going to just turn the sample down a little bit, maybe to like -1.7. I do find if you leave everything at the default volume, as soon as you add in like 2 sounds that play at the same time, maybe 3, it really starts to clip. And the one thing I would like to see out of this app added, if possible, is to change the input volume, because when I'm recording from the record player, since I'm just going directly into the 3.5mm jack built into the iPad, it's really distorting a lot. So I wish I could turn down that input volume on the app, but for now I just turned down the volume a little bit and we can work with that. I also turned the sample up 2 semitones in terms of the pitch, just made it a little bit faster, and I really like the speed that it's at as well as the pitch. So now that I have that done, we'll go back into the auto chop, and we're on the lazy version. So I'm now going to press play right here, and then anytime I press this button just to the right of play, it's going to put a chop marker, and that's going to allow us to quickly create our chops. I also want to make sure that I put these chops into a choke group, because by doing that, any chops that I'm playing will sort of cut each other off and I won't have 2 playing at the same time. So I'll just put that in choke group 1, and I'll also want all of those to be on one-shot mode. That way I don't have to hold down the pad while I'm recording the sample chop. So now that I have that done, let's play the sample and I'll add in those chop markers. Let's do it. So now that I have these chop markers in here just from tapping the button manually, I can now zoom in and just make some small adjustments to make sure that they're exactly where I want them. Let's do that. Okay, so I have all of those chop markers where I want them. I'm now going to just press chop, and it's now taken all of those chops and put them across these pads. The one thing that it doesn't do is take your original sample, which is going to be my first chop, and put it into the choke group that I selected. So I'm just going to put that on choke group 1, and now that will again be cut off by any of the other samples that I play. So let's record a pattern with these chops, and then we can start just developing this beat a little bit. Let's do it. So now that I've recorded that chop, we can now look at the second biggest feature, in my opinion, on this Samurai expansion, which is I can now actually look at the MIDI notes on the grid and make edits or delete certain notes, add certain notes manually, which I couldn't do before. I had to, if I didn't play it perfectly, I would just have to press undo and try again. I can now double click on this pattern right here, which brings us into this grid view where I can look at the individual notes, take some out, make changes. And this is a huge addition because if you're adding multiple layers on top of this pattern, if you make a mistake, you don't want to rely on just pressing undo. You want to be able to actually go in, make changes manually, and you'll just have that sort of reliability. So that being said, let's add some drums on this pattern, see if we can get this beat even further. Let's see what we can do with it. I really like where this beat's coming together so far. For the drums, I quantized the snare, but I turned off quantization when I was recording that hi-hat and kick. You'll also see that I copied the hi-hat onto a second pad and lowered the velocity. That way I could kind of play two velocities like this. But with the new update, it actually does allow you to change the velocity of each sound after the fact. So you can go into that grid view that we looked at earlier, but you can actually edit each of the individual MIDI notes for their velocity. So now let's add a bass line onto this beat. I'll import a bass sample in here, and then we can use the melodic mode to kind of actually play a bass line in using the piano. Let's do it. So now to add a little bit of variation to this beat, I'm just going to add in a really simple second sequence. There's only a few chops here, so there's not a ton that we can do to sort of develop a different pattern, but I'll make something really simple that we can just sort of go to every once in a while, as well as just lay down maybe a sound that we can use for the intro. So let's lay down those things. I'll add drums and bass onto those, and then I think this beat will be in a pretty good spot. So let's do it. Okay, I hope you liked how this beat turned out, and I hope that this video showed some of the additional features you get with Samurai, and to be honest, I think it's worth the extra money. It's only $4, so with those extra capabilities, you're really getting like a full sampler. Some of the things that you can do on here are a pretty similar experience to what you have with some physical hardware. To me, this will never replace physical hardware because I really just love the feeling of turning knobs, pressing buttons, and just having that full experience, but you can't beat the price. This is only $10, so it really gives you a ton of capabilities for that. The other thing you get out of the Samurai expansion is time stretching. That means that you can basically make a sample longer or shorter without changing the pitch. This is something that I probably wouldn't use. I don't use it on any of my other gear, but it is a cool feature that you get for that additional cost. But I really appreciate you hanging out, making this beat with me, supporting. I love you so much. Thank you. Peace.